All right, so now that you've had a bit of background on Canada's global development approach through results-based management, or RBM, the FIAP, the Feminist International Assistance Policy, and environmental sustainability and climate action and our approach to that, let's take a quick look at the logic model and the performance measurement framework for IGNITE specifically. If you'd like, you can pause the video here and open up the copy of the logic model and PMF that your country office has provided so you can follow along. As you would have learned by now, WUSC through the IGNITE project aims to take a systems approach to change. As such, IGNITE specifically selected partner organizations and PAC members who are already working on the common problem of inequalities and barriers faced by vulnerable youth and young women on their journeys to gain meaningful and decent economic opportunities. Most partners and stakeholders are already contributing to solutions to this problem, usually individually through their own programming and sometimes jointly. The ultimate outcome of the project, as we learned through the results-based management module, is the highest level of change that a project can contribute to. And in the case of IGNITE, volunteers and staff will work together with partners to contribute to the improved social and economic well-being of poor and marginalized youth, particularly young women, in the countries and communities that the project operates in. So all IGNITE partners, like yourself, are already well poised to contribute to the ultimate outcome of the project. And WUSC volunteers and staff will support you to continue to do this through your individual programming, but also jointly through a systems approach. At the highest level, it is the project's theory that with the engagement of international volunteers, partners can be supported to improve the performance both individually and collectively, to be able to improve the social and economic well-being of poor and marginalized youth. So remember back to the results-based management approach, we said the ultimate outcome is a change of state or a change in being for, in this case, women and youth. The intermediate outcomes are behavior level change, performance of the partners, and engagement in global development of Canadian volunteers and the Canadian public. So let's take a closer look at the project's theory of change by doing a bit of a deeper dive in looking at who we're working with across the project in terms of partner organizations. So remember that IGNITE's primary intervention to support partner performance improvements is capacity strengthening. Both organizational and technical capacity support through international volunteers is the primary mechanism. So although the ultimate outcome is a change in state or being for youth, particularly young women, our volunteers and staff don't work directly with the youth. Your organization works with the youth and women who are the ultimate outcome actors for the project. So we aim to strengthen partner capacities so that they can contribute to improving outcomes for youth, so that they can improve their programs and services for youth, such that ultimately youth can have improved livelihoods and well-being. And because we are using a systems approach, we're working with many different types of partners, including partners who have many different roles to play in improving youth outcomes: education and training, private sector, government regulators, incubators, accelerators, policymakers, media, financial services, women's rights organizations, employers, etc. They all also engage with youth at various points in their own employment and entrepreneurship journeys, which means that there's a great opportunity to infuse gender equality and environmental sustainability and climate action along the spectrum of support services. And that also means that by bringing these various partners together, we might be able to jointly solve problems that are caused by overlaps in this journey or gaps in this journey. So depending on the type of organization that you work for and your position within the organization, it might sometimes be hard to see how the work that you're doing contributes to the ultimate outcome, which is why it's so important to always keep the big picture in mind. Your organization is working with the volunteers and WUSC staff to strengthen your capacities and ultimately to improve the products and services that you provide to youth, particularly young women, which is your performance. This can contribute to the well-being and economic potential of youth. The capacity building that you were working on for your organization might be related to organizational capacities, things like IT, HR, comms, communications, finance, or it can be related to the programming side of your work, program design, gender integration and mainstreaming, environmental assessments, monitoring and evaluation of programs, etc. It's always important to keep this systems approach in mind. We selected a variety of partners so that we can better support outcomes for youth across a whole system, rather than focusing on strengthening one element of a system, for example, education or incubators. With a systems approach, all youth economic opportunity stakeholders can be supported to be gender transformative and environmentally sustainable, rather than just one sector, and we can address the organizational gaps and advocate and work together to address system level gaps.
Remember that horizontal logic model slide where we talked about the assumptions. And remember that behind all logic models are assumptions about how the if-then logic works, right? So for example, there can often be an assumption that behaviors will change simply as a result of an intervention. Take the example of the introduction of a certain technology. The assumption is that behaviors will change according to that technology. But we really have to break that down and think about the assumptions and whether they can actually influence the change that we anticipate occurring. So I'll use a very practical and relevant example to describe the assumptions. So let's take the example of introducing computers in schools. So there might be a theory, for example, that someone says if computers are introduced in classrooms, then the performance of students will increase. Well, that's a really big jump, right? That's a jump from an input, the computers, the technology, all the way down to, or all the way up to an intermediate outcome, right? The performance of students will increase, right? And then you could take from there maybe that the ultimate outcome would be they'll be better employed if we did a tracer study, for example, and track students after they leave the institution. So there's a lot of assumptions hidden in that huge jump from inputs to that intermediate outcome. So for example, what might some of the assumptions be? Well, there might be an assumption built in there that the teachers are qualified to teach using computers, that they don't need to go back and get training on using those computers. I think in this day and age, that's probably a fair assumption. But there might also be an assumption that the elements of the curriculum can be easily converted into electronic modules. Not such a great assumption, right? That may not be such an easy thing to do. And there even might be assumptions based on internet connectivity. So, certainly this would work in a place where there's high internet connectivity and a sustainable power supply, but maybe not in contexts where the internet is a little bit more unstable. So it's important to look at the hidden assumptions in project planning and that these are really acknowledged and even challenged before implementation. So the assumptions that underlie a program's theory often represent conditions that are necessary for success and that the project design team really believed are true. So sometimes to the extent that they didn't even question them in design phase. So it's always important to think about what are these assumptions that we've built into the project that we say, in order for the project to succeed, these assumptions have to be true. So what are some of the assumptions for the IGNItE project? First, we have designed the project assuming that partners have programs or can design programs that can impact the social and economic well-being, so that the ultimate outcome of improved well-being for poor and marginalized youth can actually be achieved. Another assumption is that the sustainable changes can be achieved. So not just change, but change that can outlast the project, right? So sustainable outcomes. We've built the project on the assumption that volunteers are available for assignments. We've built the project on the assumption that volunteers are able to travel, right? Which in a COVID context may not actually be something that's possible. Certainly in the first year, that's proven to be difficult. We've also built it on the assumption that capacity buildings like group trainings will be allowable, which again, with group restrictions in place, may also not be something that's possible immediately. And we've also built it on the assumption that capacity buildings activities can be transitioned where necessary, and also that political and government contexts remain favorable for international volunteer cooperation. So these are the assumptions. They always have to be taken into account when we're not only doing our life of project planning, but also our annual planning to see if the outcomes that we have anticipated can still be achieved based on these assumptions. Okay, so this is a visualization that I put together in hopes of making the logic model a little bit simpler to visualize. So here on this slide, you're already an expert in results-based management by now, so you already know that we just have the results level here depicted on this slide. So at the top, we've got the ultimate outcome, in the middle is the intermediate outcomes, and at the bottom is the immediate outcomes. So it's key to remember that this is just the top half of the logic model. It doesn't tell us how we will implement the project, but rather what is the logic of the results, i.e., can this lead to that, or if this, then that. So if we look along the left side of the diagram, we've got outcome 1100, which will support partners to have improved capacity to analyze and understand the needs and aspirations of poor and marginalized youth, particularly women. The second one, we've got improved capacity to develop, test, and scale innovative gender-responsive programming for the equitable economic empowerment of vulnerable youth. And this outcome will ensure that partners have the knowledge, skills, and business models needed to pilot, scale, and innovate programs and services. And it really draws upon the contextual knowledge and awareness gained through the previous outcome, which is about increased awareness. So in the third outcome is increased capacity to develop, improve, and implement inclusive gender-responsive policies and practices that reflect the needs, interests, and aspirations of vulnerable youth, particularly women. And this outcome ensures that partners have policies and structures in place to ensure sustainability of the changes that occurred in the previous two outcomes. So you can see there's also that horizontal logic built into the project. So depending on the type of partner organizations, partner staff will engage in capacity building activities supported by the Canadian Volunteers in order to increase their overall performance, partners' overall performance, and the ability to serve the ultimate outcome, which is their youth constituents. So depending again on the type of partner, they will either be serving their youth directly through improved programming or indirectly through advocacy campaigns, facilitation of change, of market system change. For the other side, the other intermediate outcome, which is about increased engagement of Canadians, our theory is that through improved understanding of key global development issues and the strengthened capacities, so knowledge and skills, of Canadians to contribute to global development efforts, this will result in increased and sustained engagement of Canadians in global development. So again, the changes in awareness, capacity to develop, test, and scale, develop, improve, and implement sustainable policies and practices. The theory is that these three outcomes on the left will lead to an increased performance of partners to deliver programs and services that will contribute to the ultimate outcome, which is improved social and economic well-being of youth. For volunteers, improved understanding of global development issues and strengthened capacity to contribute to global development issues will result in increased engagement of diverse groups of Canadians. And that is, the international volunteers contributing to global development who will contribute to the increased performance of partners and ultimately the improved social and economic well-being of poor and marginalized youth, particularly women. So that's the logic model in a nutshell, the top half anyway, the results half. And what we'll do in the next slide is really take a closer look at what we're going to do, which is implementation and how you'll contribute to that.
Now let's take a look at the bottom of the logic model, which is the outputs of our planned activities. If the logic works in practice, then the combined achievements of the outputs, which are the bullet points here, will contribute to the achievement of the immediate outcomes, which is the text in blue. Again, if the logic works in practice, the combined achievement of the immediate outcomes in blue will contribute to the achievement of the intermediate outcome, which is the outcome statement written in the left panel. Take outcome 1110 and use if-then statements. If partner organizations are supported to advance gender equality and inclusion of youth and women, and if partner staff are sensitized to gender equality and inclusion, and if women's organizations are supported to advocate for gender equality, inclusion, and women's economic empowerment, and if partners are supported to engage vulnerable youth as advocates, then the result for partners will be increased awareness of policies and practices that perpetuate gender-based inequalities and constrain access of youth to employment initiatives and services. And further, if awareness is increased, and the capacity to test, scale, and innovate is increased, and the capacity to develop, improve, and implement gender-responsive policies and practices is increased, then the result may be that partners' performance to deliver programs and services that advance gender equality is increased. It's important to remember here that the intermediate outcome does represent a behavior change, a change in the way that we do things, as opposed to these three immediate outcomes here in blue, which are an increase in knowledge or represent an increase in knowledge and capacity to be able to do things differently, if you will. So there are some hidden assumptions in here between having the capacity to do things differently and then actually doing things differently. And that's something we need to work with each organization, with each partner on, and for you to seriously consider as a partner organization to think about these assumptions. As we get further and further up in the logic model, it's less and less about what the project can do in terms of an intervention, and it's much more about what the partners can do differently with the knowledge and capacity that they have gained. So some of the assumptions we've made here in order to plan for achieving improved performance across all partner organizations are: 1, that the project's capacity strengthening approaches will motivate partners to innovate or improve programs that will reduce barriers and meet the needs of vulnerable youth and women. 2, that the counterparts or partner staff who participate in capacity strengthening activities will apply knowledge, attitudes, and skills to the programs and policies that they create. And 3, that partners will apply lessons learned from other project stakeholders working in similar fields, which could be in-country or even learned globally from other project stakeholders, to their own initiatives and services. So it's really critical that partners consider the active role that they will need to take in terms of applying knowledge gained, those immediate outcomes, to the changes that they want to make in their organization to better meet the needs and aspirations of youth, and particularly women, which is the intermediate outcome of performance. The logic model and the PMF are key to understanding the big picture of the project. Although they are very text heavy, I do encourage you to go through them and work with the country manager or SPO at the WSC office to make sure that you have a good understanding of them. These two documents help us really to keep the end in mind in terms of what we're working towards. Remember, it's a plan. Improved social and economic well-being of poor and marginalized youth, particularly young women. Let's quickly look at the tool that we use to measure our activities, outputs, and some of those changes we've been discussing in the previous slides in the logic model, those higher level changes, immediate, intermediate, and ultimate outcome. And that tool is called the Performance Measurement Framework, or the PMF. This is a framework that helps us to guide the measurement of the project's activities and results. So in summary, a PMF serves two main purposes. One, to support the effective management of the programs, and two, to support accountability to community members by providing evidence of progress and change. PMFs can be used to focus on priority goals, to define criteria that will be used to measure success, to monitor progress towards goals, to identify opportunities for making improvements, and to report to community members, stakeholders, and donors about results achieved. The PMF is really a tool used in results-based management, or RBM, that presents us with an overview, and there's various sections in the PMF that talk about, of course, the expected outputs and outcomes, how to track and measure your progress through indicators, provides targets, baselines. It talks about what data sources you should use for verification or evidence, how you'll collect your data, at what frequency, and who is responsible for the data collection. So indicators is a word that you'll hear a lot in the project, especially around work planning time and reporting time. Indicators help us to measure performance against an outcome or an output. An indicator is a specific, observable, measurable characteristic that can be used to measure changes or progress in a program that project or program is making towards achieving a specific outcome. So it's important for us to consider how we know and how we can prove that there has been an improvement in the social and economic well-being of poor and marginalized youth, i.e. your constituents as partners. And what we've tried to do as you look through the PMF is provide at least two indicators for our higher level outcomes and at least one, possibly two indicators for each output. So here's an example for us to think about how we use indicators. How do we know, and as I said, how can we prove that there has been improvement in the social and economic well-being of the youth that we support through the project? Sure, we can say that we worked hard to make this happen through building capacity building exercises, training, funding, etc. But how do we really know if we as a project and project partners have been successful? We need indicators to measure this success in the eyes of the youth and young women that are supported by partners. So we need to ask them, are the programs that have been designed, the new programs or improved programs, meeting your needs? Have your employment levels increased? Do you feel empowered to participate in the design of new programs, etc.? Here's another example. How do we know if we've been successful in improving your capacities as partners in developing, testing, and scaling innovative programs? So if we were not using results-based management, for example, we could just say, well, we did this great training, and this many people attended, but in our view at WUSC, that's not enough. We need to set indicators that assess these improvements or changes from your perspective as a partner. We need indicators that will measure your capacities before and after the experience that relates to this change. And if during our implementation we find that we are not progressing toward an outcome, and then the results of our indicators the results of our measurement against our indicators should tell us that. We need to be able to learn from our data whether we are being successful or not, whether we are progressing, or whether we need to make a course correction. We share the responsibility for reporting on indicators as a project between our staff, our partner organizations like yourselves, and our volunteers. So your country office staff will be reaching out to you, or has already reached out to you, as partners to gauge your need in terms of M&E capacity to be able to report on performance progress. and results, and also to get your support to be able to provide data on the project indicators. All right, so this wraps up the introductory overview to the IGNITE project. If you'd like more information or you have questions, please do go ahead and reach out to the WUSC staff in your country to follow up. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this overview of the IGNITE project. If you have any other questions or you have any follow-up and you'd like to discuss it with your country manager, please do feel free to reach out. Thanks again for taking the time. Take good care. Bye-bye.